The car was already burning when people began to step back. Flames wrapped around the black SUV, thick smoke rising as a man pounded desperately against the window from inside. The crowd froze, whispering, recording, but no one moved closer. Until a girl ran forward, barefoot. Quiet. The kind of person the city never notices. Ifeoma didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy stone and struck the glass again and again until it shattered. Heat rushed out as she reached in, pulling the man toward her with all the strength she had. Moments later, he was out. But as sirens grew louder and people rushed in, she was already gone. No one saw her leave. No one knew who saved him. Before anyone would ever call her brave. Before strangers would whisper her name with admiration. Ifeoma Okeke was just another invisible girl on the streets of Lagos. Every morning she woke before the sun. Not because she wanted to, but because hunger did not wait. The small wooden room she shared with her grandmother, Mama Ngozi, stood at the edge of a crowded settlement near Oshodi. The roof leaked when it rained, and during the dry season, dust slipped through every crack, settling over their few belongings like a quiet reminder of how fragile life was. There was no proper bed, just a thin mat on the floor, no fan, no steady electricity, only survival. Ifeoma lay still for a moment, staring at the ceiling as faint early light filtered through the torn curtain. Beside her, Mama Ngozi coughed softly, a deep, tired sound that had become part of the rhythm of their mornings. That sound always pulled Ifeoma out of whatever little rest she had managed to find. She turned quickly. "Mama," she whispered, gently sitting up. Mama Ngozi gave a faint smile, though her eyes were heavy with exhaustion. "You're awake already, my child. I should have woken earlier," Ifeoma replied softly, reaching for the small plastic cup beside them. "You need to take your medicine." Medicine. The word itself felt heavier than it should, because every tablet came with a price they could barely afford. Ifeoma helped her grandmother sit up slowly, careful not to cause discomfort. Her movements were practiced, gentle, patient, filled with quiet love. There was no one else to help, no one else to call. They only had each other. Outside, the sounds of Lagos were already rising, distant horns shouting, vendors' footsteps rushing toward another day of struggle. Life never paused here, and neither could she. After making sure Mama Ngozi swallowed the medicine, Ifeoma stepped outside, balancing a small basin of water to wash her face. The air was already warm, carrying the scent of dust and street food from nearby stalls. She closed her eyes briefly. Just one moment, not to dream, but to breathe. Then she went back inside and reached for the tray. Corn. That was what she sold. Roasted corn by the roadside, standing for hours under the sun, calling out to passing strangers who often didn't even look at her. Some days she sold enough to eat twice, some days only once. And on the worst days, she told Mama Ngozi she had already eaten just so the old woman wouldn't worry. "I'll be back before evening," Ifeoma said softly as she adjusted the tray. Mama Ngozi watched her with quiet concern. "Don't stay too long in the sun today. You were coughing last night." Ifeoma forced a small smile. "I'll be fine, Mama." She always said that, even when she wasn't. As she stepped out into the narrow street, people were already moving quickly. Faces, serious voices, sharp, everyone chasing something that never seemed to slow down. No one noticed her, and she didn't expect them to. At the roadside, she found her usual spot near a busy junction where buses stopped and engines idled in long, impatient lines. Smoke from passing vehicles mixed with the heat, making the air thick and heavy. Still, she stood tall. "Fresh corn, hot corn," she called out, her voice steady despite the early strain. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. Sweat gathered at her temples, but she ignored it. A man in a clean shirt walked past, brushing against her tray without apology. Another waved her away impatiently when she stepped closer. A group of young boys laughed loudly as they passed. "Who will buy from you?" one of them mocked. "You look tired already." Ifeoma didn't respond. She had learned long ago that silence was sometimes stronger than words. Not every battle needed to be fought out loud. Around midday, she finally sold enough to buy a small bottle of water and a piece of bread. She sat briefly under the thin shade of a broken umbrella stand nearby, taking slow bites. But even then, she didn't relax. Her eyes stayed alert, watching, because life had taught her something important. When you have little, you cannot afford to lose even that. As she finished eating, she noticed an elderly man sitting a few steps away. His clothes were worn, his shoulders slightly bent with age. He hadn't said anything, but his eyes lingered on the bread in her hands. Ifeoma hesitated, just for a second. Then she broke the remaining piece in half and stood up. "Sir," she said gently, holding it out to him. The man looked surprised. "For me?" She nodded. He took it slowly, his hands trembling slightly. "God will bless you, my daughter." Ifeoma smiled faintly. She didn't give because she had enough. She gave because she understood what it meant to have nothing. By late afternoon, her legs ached. Her voice had grown hoarse. But she kept going, because Mama Ngozi would be waiting, because medicine had to be bought again soon, because rest was a luxury she couldn't afford. As the sun began to lower, painting the sky in soft orange, Ifeoma packed what little remained on her tray. Not everything had sold, but it would have to be enough. She adjusted the tray and began the long walk home, weaving through the same crowded streets, past the same rushing strangers, under the same endless noise of Lagos life, invisible, unnoticed, unseen. Yet inside her, there was something the world had not managed to take. A quiet strength, a heart that still chose kindness, a courage that had not yet been tested, but soon would be. And when that moment came, it would change everything. Long before, people would speak his name with respect, before newspapers would print his face on glossy pages. Obinawez had learned one thing about power. It does not protect you from betrayal. It only makes it harder to see it coming. The headquarters of Easy Logistics Group stood tall in Victoria Island, Lagos. Glass walls reflecting the city's restless energy, polished floors echoing the footsteps of people who moved with purpose, ambition, and quiet fear. Because inside that building, one man's approval could change your life, and his disapproval could end it. Obinawez did not raise his voice often. He didn't need to. At 39, he had built one of the most influential logistics companies in West Africa. From shipping contracts to government partnerships, his reach extended far beyond what most people could see. But power came with a cost, and that cost was trust. "Explain this to me again." His voice was calm, controlled, but there was something beneath it, something sharp. Across the long conference table, Mr. Kalu shifted slightly in his seat. A seasoned executive in his 50s, he had been with the company for over a decade. Loyal, efficient, or at least, that was what everyone believed. "There must be a misunderstanding," Sir Kalu said carefully. "The figures you're seeing, I'm not asking for excuses," Obina cut in quietly. The room fell silent. Even the air seemed to pause. Obina leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes fixed on the documents spread across the table. Numbers, transactions, transfers that didn't align. Money that had moved, without explanation. "I'm asking for the truth." No one spoke. Around the table sat the core leadership team, people who wore confidence like armor, who understood how to navigate power, who knew exactly how dangerous silence could be. Among them, sat Chioma Nwoye. Young, sharp, observant, she had risen quickly through the company, earning Obina's trust with her intelligence and precision. If there was anyone in that room who understood him, it was her. Or so he thought. Chioma cleared her throat softly. "Sir, perhaps we should conduct a full internal audit before drawing conclusions," she suggested, her tone measured. "There could be external factors we haven't identified yet." Obina's gaze shifted to her. For a brief moment something softened, because unlike the others, Chioma never appeared rattled, never defensive, always composed. "That's already been done," Obina replied. A quiet ripple of tension passed through the room. "And the results?" Chioma asked. Obina slid a document across the table. Straight toward her. Chioma glanced down. Her expression didn't change. But inside, something tightened. "The discrepancies are internal," Obina said, "which means someone in this room is either careless or dishonest." The word hung in the air like a weight. Dishonest. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. Because in a place like this, accusations didn't need to be shouted. They only needed to be said once. Mr. Kalu adjusted his tie. "Sir, with all due respect, these are serious claims. We should not jump to, 'I built this company from nothing,'" Obina said, his voice still calm but now edged with something harder. "I know what every number should look like. I know how money moves." He paused, then added quietly, "And I know when it's being stolen." Silence, heavy, uncomfortable. Chioma looked up again, meeting his gaze. "Then we will find who is responsible," she said firmly. For a moment it sounded like loyalty, like support, but something about it felt rehearsed. Obina leaned back in his chair, studying each face at the table. Years of leadership had taught him how to read people. Small shifts, avoided eye contact, the way hands tightened slightly under pressure. And yet, nothing was clear. That was the most dangerous part, because betrayal rarely looked like betrayal. It often looked like trust. "Meeting adjourned," Obina said finally. Chairs moved quickly, papers gathered, people stood, each carrying their own version of the truth out of the room. But as they began to leave, Obina's voice stopped them. "Mr. Kalu, Chioma." They both paused. "Stay." The door closed behind the others. Now it was just the three of them. The silence felt different, more personal, more dangerous. Obina stood slowly, walking toward the large glass window that overlooked the city. Cars moved like endless streams below, people rushing lives, intersecting without ever truly connecting. For a moment, he said nothing. "Then I trusted both of you. It wasn't an accusation. It was something worse. Disappointment." Mr. Kalu spoke first. "And you still can, sir." Obina didn't turn. "Can I?" His reflection in the glass stared back at him. Tired, guarded, alone. Chioma stepped forward slightly. "You can trust me." There it was again, calm, confident, perfectly measured. But Obina had lived too long in a world where words meant nothing without proof. "Trust," he said quietly, "is not something you ask for." He turned now. "It's something you prove." Chioma held his gaze, unflinching. "I will." For a moment, neither of them looked away. Then Obina nodded once. "You have 1 week," he said. "I want answers." Mr. Kalu's jaw tightened slightly. 1 week may not be enough to... "It's enough," Obina interrupted. Because time was no longer a luxury. Not when something inside his company was already breaking. As the meeting ended and they stepped out into the corridor, the atmosphere shifted again, back to polished professionalism, quiet conversations, controlled expressions. But beneath it all, something had changed. Inside his office, Obina loosened his tie slightly, walking toward his desk. He didn't sit immediately. Instead, he opened a drawer and pulled out a small, worn photograph. It showed a younger version of him, standing beside a woman with kind eyes. His mother. She had died years ago, before the company grew, before the power, before the walls. "You said success would not change me," he murmured softly. His thumb brushed lightly over the edge of the photo. "But you didn't tell me it would isolate me." He set the photo down carefully. Because the truth was, the higher he climbed, the fewer people he could trust, and now even that small circle was beginning to crack. Outside, the city continued as it always did. Unaware, unconcerned. Somewhere on another side of Lagos, a girl was walking home with tired feet and quiet strength. And here, a man sat in a tower of glass surrounded by power, yet slowly realizing something dangerous, that when the moment truly came, power might not be enough to save him. And the people closest to him might be the ones he should fear the most. The day did not begin like a disaster. It began like any other day Lagos had seen 1,000 times before, loud, restless, and unforgiving. By mid-morning, the sun was already high, pressing down on the city with a heavy heat that clung to skin and slowed even the strongest steps. Traffic stretched endlessly across the major roads, horns blaring in impatient rhythm as Danfo buses squeezed through impossible spaces. Life moved fast. Too fast for anyone to notice when something was about to go wrong. At the headquarters of Eze Logistics, tension still lingered from the morning's meeting. Obinna Eze stood in his office, staring at the documents spread across his desk. The numbers refused to settle in his mind. They shifted, rearranged, whispered, the same thing over and over: something is wrong. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temple. A knock came at the door. "Come in." Ifeoma stepped inside. Her expression was composed as always, but there was a quiet urgency in her eyes. "I've started reviewing the internal reports again," she said. "There are patterns, but nothing definitive yet." Obinna didn't look up immediately. "Patterns don't steal money," he replied. "People do." Ifeoma paused, then nodded slightly. "I'll keep digging." For a moment, silence filled the room again. Then Obinna straightened, closing the file in front of him. "I'm leaving," he said. Ifeoma blinked. "Now?" "Yes." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Sometimes distance helped him think. Sometimes being away from the walls of power reminded him of something more real. Ifeoma stepped aside as he walked past her, her eyes following him briefly before she turned away. By the time Obinna reached the ground floor, his driver had already brought the SUV around. "Where to, sir?" the driver asked. "Lekki, Phase 1. Obinna replied, sliding into the back seat. The car pulled into traffic almost immediately. Outside, Lagos unfolded in layers, glass buildings giving way to crowded markets, then back again to highways filled with movement and noise. Inside the car, it was quiet, cool, controlled. Obinna leaned back, his gaze fixed on the passing city. His mind, however, was elsewhere. On numbers, on trust, on the growing realization that something inside his company was slipping beyond his control. He didn't notice how tightly his hand had curled against the seat. He didn't notice how his breathing had grown slightly heavier, and he certainly didn't notice the car that had been following them for several minutes, at a distance, careful, watching. Across the city, Ifeoma Okeki adjusted the tray on her head as she stepped out of a small pharmacy. The plastic bag in her hand crinkled softly as she tightened her grip. Medicine. Again. The cost had been higher this time. She had hesitated, before paying, counting the money twice, her heart sinking with each coin she handed over. But Mama Ngozi needed it. That was never a question. Still, as she stepped back into the street, the weight of it pressed down on her. Not just the tray, but everything else. The responsibility, the uncertainty, the quiet fear of what would happen if one day She simply couldn't afford it anymore. She pushed the thought away. There was no space for fear, only movement. The road ahead was crowded, filled with vehicles inching forward in uneven bursts. Drivers leaned on their horns, frustration spilling into the open air. Ifeoma walked along the edge of the road, carefully, her eyes alert. She had done this 1,000 times. She knew how to move between danger, how to read the rhythm of traffic, how to stay unseen. But today, something felt off. She couldn't explain it. It was just a feeling, a shift, a tension in the air that didn't belong. Inside the SUV, Obina's driver slowed slightly as traffic tightened ahead. "So there's congestion," he said. Obina nodded absently. His attention had drifted again, caught somewhere between suspicion and exhaustion. Up ahead, a truck struggled to merge into the lane. Cars pressed too close, too fast, too impatient. Everything began to compress into a single moment. Ifeoma saw it first, not clearly, not all at once, just fragments, the sudden swerve, the sharp angle of the truck, the way the SUV ahead tried to avoid it. Too quickly, too late, her breath caught. Inside the SUV, Obina felt the shift, a sudden pull, the violent jerk of motion as the driver tried to correct. Tires screeched, the world tilted, then impact. The sound was deafening, metal against metal, glass cracking, everything folding into chaos. The force threw Obina forward before the seatbelt snapped him back. For a moment, there was nothing but ringing silence. Then came the smoke, thick, dark, creeping into the car like something alive. "Sir," the driver coughed, struggling to move. But the front of the vehicle had crumpled, trapped, pinned. Obina tried to push himself up. Pain shot through his body. His head spun. The door wouldn't open. The air grew hotter, harder to breathe. Outside, people began to gather. Voices rose, shouting, confusion, but no one came closer. Because now flames had started, small at first, then growing, hungry. Ifeoma dropped her tray. The sound barely registered. Her heart was already racing, her feet already moving before her mind could catch up. Around her, people were stopping, watching, pointing, but not stepping forward. "Fire," someone shouted. "Stay back," another warned. It might explode. Fear spread quickly, faster than the flames. Ifeoma pushed through the forming crowd, her eyes fixed on the SUV. She could see movement inside. Someone was still there, still alive. Her chest tightened. "No," she whispered under her breath. "Not like this, not while people were just standing there." Inside the car, Obina's hands struck weakly against the window. The glass held. His strength was fading. The heat pressed closer. The smoke thickened. Each breath became harder than the last. Through blurred vision, he saw shapes outside. People, so many people, watching, but none of them moved. A strange realization settled in his chest. Not anger, not even fear, just something cold. So, this is how it ends. Surrounded, but alone. Then suddenly, movement. A figure broke through the stillness. Running, coming closer. Obina's fading vision struggled to focus. A girl, small, determined. "Ifeoma, stop," someone shouted behind her. But she didn't stop. Couldn't. Her mind had already made the decision. Her body was just catching up. She reached the burning vehicle, the heat forcing her back for a split second. Her breath caught, but only for a moment. Because inside, she saw his eyes. Desperate, fading, human. That was all it took. She looked around quickly. A stone lay near the roadside. She grabbed it, turned, and without hesitation, she ran toward the fire. The crowd gasped. Someone shouted again, but this time it didn't matter. Because for the first time since the accident, someone had chosen to act. And in that moment, everything changed. The heat hit her like a wall. For a split second, Ifeoma's body resisted, every instinct telling her to step back to protect herself, to survive. But then she looked again, through the smoke, through the growing flames, and she saw him, his hand pressed weakly against the glass, his eyes fading, searching, pleading without words. That was enough. Fear no longer mattered. Ifeoma tightened her grip around the stone. "Please," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to him or to herself. Then she swung. The first strike echoed sharply against the glass. It didn't break. The vibration shot through her arm, but she held on. Behind her, voices rose again. "Leave it! It's too dangerous, girl, come back." But the words felt distant, like they belonged to another world. She raised the stone again and struck harder. A crack spread across the surface of the window. Not enough. Not yet. Inside, Obina could barely see clearly anymore. Everything was blurred, distorted by heat and smoke. But he felt it. The impact. The faint tremor of hope. Someone was there. Someone was trying. His hand lifted weakly toward the sound. He didn't have strength left to shout, only to reach. Outside, Ifeoma stepped closer. The heat intensified immediately, wrapping around her, pressing against her skin. The air was thick, each breath heavier than the last. Her eyes watered, but she refused to step back. Not now, not when she was this close. She raised the stone again, and struck. This time the glass shattered. The sound cut through the chaos. Fragments fell inward. The heat burst outward in a rush, forcing her to turn her face away for a moment. But she didn't retreat. She dropped the stone and reached in. The air inside the car was suffocating. Her fingers searched blindly at first, then found him, his arm, heavy, unresponsive. "Hold on!" she shouted, her voice breaking through the noise. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she needed him to. Obina felt the touch, faint, uncertain, but real. He tried to respond, tried to move. His body refused. Everything inside him felt distant, like it no longer belonged to him. But the presence, that was real, and for the first time since the crash, he wasn't alone. Ifeoma tightened her grip and pulled. Nothing. His body barely shifted. He was too heavy. The angle was wrong. The car was partially crushed, trapping him deeper than she expected. For a moment, just a moment, doubt flickered. What if she couldn't do it? What if she was too late? The thought hit hard, but she pushed it away just as quickly. No, not like this. She adjusted her footing, bracing one leg against the edge of the damaged door. Then she reached in again this time, grabbing both his arm and the collar of his shirt. "Please," she whispered again, her voice strained. Not to him, to strength, to time, to anything that would listen. Then she pulled, harder, her muscles strained, her breath shook. The world around her blurred as everything narrowed into one single effort. Move, just move. Inside, Obina felt something shift. Pain, sharp, sudden, but it was something. It meant he was still there, still connected to the moment, still alive. His body responded slightly, just enough to shift his weight, and that was all Ifeoma needed. She pulled again. This time he moved. Inches, then more. The sound of metal creaked as his body slid free from where it had been pinned. The crowd behind her gasped. Some stepped closer now, but still. No one touched, no one joined, only watched. Ifeoma didn't notice them. She couldn't. All her focus was on him, on getting him out, on beating the time she could feel slipping away. She pulled again, and suddenly, he was free. His body slumped forward, collapsing partially against her. The weight nearly knocked her off balance, but she held on. Somehow, somewhere inside, her strength kept rising, even when it should have run out. "Come," she whispered, struggling to support him. Step by step, she dragged him away from the vehicle. Each movement felt heavier than the last. Each second stretched. The heat followed them. The danger still close. But she didn't stop. Not until they were far enough. Not until the fire was no longer reaching for them. Finally, her legs gave slightly as she lowered him carefully onto the ground. The world rushed back all at once. Noise, voices, movement. People were closer now, phones raised, eyes wide, but none of that mattered. Ifeoma leaned over him, her chest rising and falling quickly as she tried to catch her breath. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked softly. No response. Her heart tightened. She hesitated, then placed her hand lightly against his chest. There. A faint rhythm, slow but present. Relief washed over her so suddenly, it almost made her dizzy. "You're alive," she whispered. For a moment, she simply stayed there, not thinking about who he was, not thinking about what this meant. Just human to human, alive to alive. Then in the distance, sirens, loud, approaching fast. The crowd shifted again, energy changing as emergency responders began to arrive. And just like that, the moment that had been hers began to slip away. Ifeoma looked around. People were already talking, already pointing, already telling their own versions of what had happened. But none of them were looking at her. Not really. To them, she was just part of the scene, not the reason it had changed. Slowly, she stood. Her body felt weak now, heavy. The strength that had carried her through was fading just as quickly as it had come. She glanced down at him one last time, at the man whose life had almost ended, at the stranger she had refused to leave behind. Then, without a word, she stepped back. One step, then another, until she was no longer at the center, until she was just another face in the crowd again. By the time the paramedics reached him, she was gone, disappeared into the same city that had always overlooked her, invisible once more. But behind her, everything had already changed, because somewhere between fear and fire, a girl no one noticed had chosen to stay, and because of that, a man who had everything was still alive. When Eze opened his eyes again, the world felt distant, not silent. No, there were sounds, soft beeping, low voices, the faint hum of machines. But everything seemed to reach him through layers, like he was still somewhere far away from his own body. He blinked slowly. White ceiling, dim lights, a hospital. The realization came gradually. Alive. He was alive. A shallow breath escaped his lips, and even that small movement felt heavier than it should. His chest rose carefully, as if testing whether it was safe to do so. Memory returned in fragments. The road, the impact, the heat, the smoke, and then a face, blurred, undefined, but there. Someone had been there. Someone had come for him. His fingers twitched slightly against the bedsheet. A nurse noticed immediately. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, stepping closer. Obinna turned his head slowly toward the voice. "Yes," he managed, though it came out weaker than he expected. Relief spread across her face. "You're in the hospital. You're safe now. Safe." The word settled in his mind, but it didn't feel complete, because something was missing. "Who?" he began, his voice still rough. "Who brought me here?" The nurse hesitated. "You were pulled from the vehicle before emergency services arrived," she explained. "A bystander. A bystander." The word felt too small, too vague. His brow tightened slightly. "Who I'm not sure," she admitted. "When the paramedics arrived, you were already outside the vehicle. No one identified themselves. No one." Obinna stared at her for a moment, then looked away, back at the ceiling. The face flickered again in his memory. A girl. He was certain of that now, Not a man, not security, not anyone trained, just a girl. And she had come into the fire for him. Why, the question lingered heavier than the pain in his body. The door opened quietly. Sir, his assistant, Chinedu Okafor, stepped in his usually composed demeanor, shaken by visible concern. "Thank God," Chinedu exhaled, moving closer. "We've been waiting for you to wake up." Obinna shifted his gaze toward him. "How long?" "Almost a day," Chinedu replied. "You lost consciousness at the scene. The doctors said you were lucky." "Lucky?" Obinna almost smiled. It didn't feel like luck. It felt like something else. Something intentional. "Find her," Obinna said suddenly. Chinedu blinked. "Sir, the person who pulled me out," Obinna continued, his voice gaining a little strength. "Find her." Chinedu hesitated briefly. "We've already started asking around. There were many people at the scene, but no one has stepped forward. No clear footage yet either." Obinna's eyes narrowed slightly. No one saw her. They saw something, Chinedu said carefully. But in situations like that, people focus on the fire, the chaos. Details get lost. Details. Like a life being saved. Obinna turned his head slightly, his gaze distant again. "She didn't get lost," he said quietly. "She left." Chinedu studied him. "You remember her not clearly," Obinna admitted. "But I know she was there. And more than that, he knew she had stayed when everyone else hadn't. That mattered, more than anything." "Then we'll find her," Chinedu said firmly. "I'll assign a team. We'll check nearby shops, traffic cameras, witnesses, everything." Obinna gave a faint nod. But even as the plan formed, something about it felt uncertain. Because the kind of person who runs toward fire and then disappears without a word was not someone who wanted to be found. Across the city, life had already returned to its usual rhythm. The road where the accident happened had been cleared. The burnt vehicle removed. Only faint marks remained, a reminder of something that had almost ended differently. But for Ifeoma Okiki, nothing had changed. Or, at least, that was how it looked from the outside. She sat quietly inside the small room she shared with Mama Ngozi, her back resting lightly against the wall. The tray of corn lay untouched beside her. Her hands rested in her lap. Still, but not steady. There was a faint tremor in her fingers she couldn't quite control. Not from fear, not anymore, but from everything her body had endured. The heat, the effort, the weight. It had all come rushing back the moment she stepped away from the scene. And now, it lingered. Mama Ngozi watched her carefully from the mat. "You're quieter than usual," the old woman said gently. "Did something happen?" Ifeoma hesitated, just for a moment. Then she shook her head slightly. It was just a long day. It wasn't a lie. But it wasn't the truth, either. Mama Ngozi studied her face, her eyes soft but knowing. "You should rest," she said. "You look tired." Ifeoma nodded, because that part was true. Exhaustion had settled deep into her bones. But sleep did not come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it again. The fire, the smoke, the man inside, the way his hand had moved weakly against the glass. And the moment their eyes met. There had been something there. Not recognition, not understanding, just human connection. The kind that didn't need names, didn't need explanations, just existed. She exhaled slowly, leaning her head back against the wall. Outside, the city continued as it always did. Unaware, unchanged. Somewhere far from her small room, conversations were happening. Phones were ringing. Decisions were being made. But none of that reached her, because she had already stepped out of that moment. Chosen to. Not because it didn't matter, but because she didn't believe it belonged to her. She had done what needed to be done. That was enough, or at least, that was what she told herself. Back at the hospital, Obinna sat up slightly in his bed, ignoring the subtle discomfort that followed the movement. A television screen mounted on the wall flickered with news coverage. CEO Obinna Eze survives near-fatal accident earlier today, the reporter's voice carried. Sources confirmed that his vehicle caught fire after a collision, but he was rescued moments before the situation escalated. The footage showed the aftermath: the burned car, the crowd, the flashing lights, but not her. No image, no name, nothing. The identity of the individual who pulled him from the vehicle remains unknown. Obinna reached for the remote and turned it off. The room fell quiet again. Unknown. The word echoed in his mind. But it didn't feel right, because to him, she wasn't unknown. She was the reason he was still breathing, and that was not something he could ignore. His gaze drifted toward the window where the fading light of evening painted the sky in soft shades of orange and gray. Somewhere out there she was living her life, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just stood between him and death. Obinna's expression hardened slightly, not with anger, but with resolve. "You don't save a life and disappear," he murmured under his breath. "Not without a reason, and whatever that reason was, he intended to find it. Because for the first time in a long time, this wasn't about business, or power, or control. It was something simpler, something human. He owed her his life, and until he found her, the debt would remain, unsettled. By the third day, Obinna Eze had stopped pretending that rest was enough. The doctors insisted he needed more time. His body agreed, but his mind refused. "Sir, you should not be moving around yet," the nurse said as she adjusted the drip beside him. Obinna gave a faint nod, but his attention was elsewhere, fixed on the city beyond the hospital window. Somewhere out there, she was walking, breathing, living her life as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed, at least for him. "Chinedu," he said quietly. His assistant, standing near the door, stepped forward immediately. "Yes, sir. Any updates?" Chinedu hesitated. That alone was enough to answer the question. "We've reviewed traffic footage from the area," he said carefully. "Most of it is either obstructed or unclear due to the smoke and crowd. A few witnesses mentioned a young woman, but descriptions are inconsistent. Inconsistent how some say she was barefoot. Others say she had a tray on her head before the accident. No one seems certain." Obinna's eyes narrowed slightly. "A tray?" Something about that detail settled differently. "Street vendor," he murmured. Chinedu nodded. "That's our assumption as well. We've started checking roadside vendors along that route." "Not enough," Obinna said. Chinedu straightened. "Sir, she didn't stay," Obinna continued. "That tells you something, that she was afraid," Chinedu suggested. "No," Obinna said quietly. "It tells me she didn't expect anything in return." The room fell silent, because that kind of thinking was rare, especially in a city where survival often demanded the opposite. Obinna turned back toward the window. "Which means she's not going to come forward," he added. Chinedu nodded slowly. "I'll expand the search," he said. "Markets, bus stops, informal vendors will cover more ground." "Do it quietly," Obinna instructed. "I don't want media attention." Chinedu paused briefly, then nodded. "Understood." As he left the room, Obinna leaned back slightly, exhaling. For the first time in years, he was chasing something that had nothing to do with profit control or influence, and yet it felt more important than any deal he had ever closed. Across the city, Ifeoma adjusted the edge of her scarf as she stepped back into the familiar chaos of the roadside. The tray of roasted corn balanced carefully on her head. Her movements were slower today, subtly, almost unnoticeable to anyone else. But she felt it. Every step reminded her of the effort her body had given days before. The heat had left its mark. The exhaustion had not fully faded. Still she was here. Because staying home was not an option. Because Mama Ngozi's medicine would not wait. Because life did not pause for recovery. Fresh corn, hot corn. She called out, her voice slightly softer than usual. The traffic moved as it always did. The crowd passed. The world continued. No one knew what she had done. And strangely, that brought her a kind of quiet comfort. No expectations, no attention. Just normal. A woman stopped briefly, bought one piece and left without a word. A man waved her away impatiently. 2 children stared at her tray before their mother pulled them along. Nothing had changed. And yet inside her something had. Every time she glanced at a passing vehicle, her chest tightened slightly. Every time she saw smoke from a roadside grill, her mind flickered back to that moment. The fire, the heat, the man's eyes. She shook the thought away gently. There was no reason to hold on to it. She had done what needed to be done. That was all, or so she told herself. Later that afternoon, a sleek black car slowed near the roadside. Unusual. Cars like that didn't stop here. Not often. Ifeoma noticed it, but only briefly. People with that kind of life didn't belong to hers. And she didn't belong to theirs. So she looked away, focused on her work. But the car didn't move. It stayed. Then the door opened. A man stepped out, well-dressed, clean. Everything about him stood in contrast to the dust of the street. Chinedu Okafor. He scanned the roadside carefully, his eyes moving from vendor to vendor, searching. Ifeoma felt the shift in the air immediately. People noticed him. They always noticed people like him. Authority, money, presence. It changed how others stood, how they spoke, how they looked. But Ifeoma kept her gaze low, not out of fear, out of habit. Chinedu approached slowly, stopping near a group of vendors. "Good afternoon," he said politely. "I'm looking for someone." The vendors exchanged glances. What kind of person, one of them asked. "A young woman," Chinedu replied. "She sells by the roadside, possibly corn." A pause. Then laughter from one of the men nearby. "That's half the girls here, sir." Chinedu gave a small, controlled smile. "She was near the Lekki Road 3 days ago," he added. "There was an accident." The laughter faded. People remembered. Of course they did. "That fire," another vendor said. "Ah, that was serious." "Yes," Chinedu said. "Do you know who helped pull the man out?" The group fell quiet. Eyes shifted, not out of ignorance, but hesitation. Because information, even simple information, could carry consequences. "I don't know," one woman said quickly. "Me too," another added. Chinedu studied them carefully. He had seen this before. People knew, but they were choosing not to say, not out of loyalty, out of caution. He nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said, stepping back. Then his gaze moved again, scanning, searching, and then he saw her. Not because she stood out, but because she didn't. Ifeoma stood quietly, holding her tray steady, her posture composed, her expression neutral. But something about her, something in the stillness, caught his attention. He walked toward her. Ifeoma felt it before she saw it. The shift, the direction, the focus. She looked up. Their eyes met. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then Chinedu offered a polite nod. "Good afternoon." "Good afternoon," she replied softly. "I'm looking for someone," he said. "A girl who was near an accident a few days ago." Ifeoma's grip on the tray tightened slightly, but her expression did not change. "I don't know," she said simply. Chinedu held her gaze. There was no fear in her eyes, no nervousness, just quiet distance, and something else, something he couldn't immediately name. "You weren't there?" he asked. A pause, barely noticeable. Then no. The answer came calmly, steady, without hesitation. Chinedu studied her for another second, then nodded. "All right," he said. "Thank you." He turned away, walking back toward the car. But something in his mind lingered. Not certainty, not proof, just a feeling. And as the car pulled away, he glanced back once more. Ifeoma had already turned away. Back to her work, back to her place in the world. Invisible. But for the first time someone had noticed, even if, only for a moment. That evening, Chinedu stood once again in Obina's hospital room. "There's someone," he said. Obina looked up immediately. "Who I'm not sure yet." Chinedu admitted. She denied being there. But Obina pressed. Chinedu hesitated slightly. There was something about her. Obina's gaze sharpened. "Find out," he said, because somewhere deep inside, he already knew. The girl who ran into fire would not be easy to find. But she had been found once, in a moment that mattered most. And now the search had truly begun. The next morning, Lagos woke up the same way it always did, loud, hurried, unforgiving. But for two people in different parts of the city, something had shifted quietly beneath the surface. For Obina's recovery had become a formality. His body was healing, his strength was returning, but his focus had narrowed to one thing and one thing alone: finding her. "Sir, the doctors are recommending at least 2 more days before discharge," Chinedu said, flipping through a file as he stood beside the hospital bed. Obina didn't respond immediately. His gaze was fixed on the report Chinedu had just handed him. Not medical, not corporate. A simple sheet of notes. Description: female, young, roadside vendor, calm demeanor, denied involvement. Below that, a location. The same roadside Chinedu had visited the previous day. Obina looked up slowly. "You spoke to her yourself?" "Yes." "And you think it's her?" Chinedu hesitated. "I think she knows something." That was enough. Obina swung his legs off the bed. Sir Chinedu stepped forward quickly. "You're not cleared to." "I didn't ask if I was cleared," Obina said calmly. He stood up. The movement was slower than usual, but steady, controlled, determined. Chinedu studied him for a moment, then closed the file. "I'll arrange the car." By midday, the same black SUV, new spotless, untouched by fire, moved through the busy Lagos streets. Inside, Obina sat in silence, his eyes scanning the city as if searching for something invisible to everyone else. The closer they got to the roadside location, the more familiar the surroundings felt. Not from memory, but from something deeper. A sense, a connection to the moment his life had nearly ended. "Stop here," he said. The car slowed, then came to a halt. Outside, nothing seemed unusual. Vendors stood by the roadside, calling out to passing cars. Traffic moved in uneven bursts, the same rhythm, the same noise, the same indifference. Obina stepped out. Immediately, heads turned. People noticed. They always did. Authority had a presence that demanded attention, but he ignored it. His focus moved across the vendors slowly, one by one, until he saw her. Ifeoma. She stood, exactly where Chinedu had described. Tray, balanced carefully, posture calm, expression distant. For a moment, everything else faded. The noise, the movement, the city itself, because something inside him recognized her. Not her face, not clearly, but the feeling. The same quiet strength that had stood against fire. He began to walk toward her. Ifeoma felt it before she looked up. The shift, the silence that followed someone important stepping into a place they didn't belong. She raised her eyes and saw him. For a brief second, time stopped. Not because she recognized his status, but because she recognized something else. The man. The one from the fire, alive, standing, looking at her. Her breath caught slightly, but she steadied herself. Because whatever this was, she did not want it to change her life. Obina stopped in front of her. Up close, the contrast between them was even clearer. His clothes, his posture, his presence, everything about him belonged to a world far removed from hers. And yet here he was, looking at her, not past her, not through her, at her. "You were there," he said. It wasn't a question. Ifeoma held his gaze. Calm, unshaken. "No," she replied. The lie came easily. Not because she was used to lying, but because the truth would complicate everything. Obinna studied her. Longer this time. There was no fear in her eyes, no hesitation, only a quiet refusal. "I remember you," he said softly. Ifeoma shook her head slightly. "You must be mistaken." Around them, people had begun to notice. Whispers spread quickly. Some recognized Obinna. Others simply recognized power. Either way, attention was building. Ifeoma felt it, and she didn't like it. "I have work to do," she added, shifting her weight slightly. "If you're not buying anything." Her voice remained respectful, but firm. A boundary. Obinna didn't move. "Ifeoma," he said. The name landed between them. She froze, just for a second. That was all he needed. "You know my name," she said quietly. "I made it my business to," he replied. Silence stretched, heavy, unavoidable. "You pulled me out of that car," Obinna continued. "Why won't you say it?" Ifeoma looked away briefly, not in guilt, in thought, because answering that question meant opening a door she had deliberately closed, and she wasn't sure she wanted to walk through it. "I didn't do it for recognition," she said finally. "I'm not offering recognition," Obinna replied. "I'm offering truth." She looked back at him. His expression had changed, softer, less guarded, more human. "You almost died," she said quietly. "Yes. And now you're standing here." "Yes." She nodded once. "Then that's enough." The simplicity of her answer caught him off guard, because in his world, nothing was ever that simple. "You risked your life," he said. "That's not something I can ignore." "I'm not asking you to," she replied. "I'm asking you to leave it." A pause. "Then why?" he asked. Ifeoma hesitated, then answered honestly. "For people like me. Things like this don't come without consequences." The words were calm, but heavy with lived truth. Obinna understood immediately. Attention brought questions. Questions brought assumptions, and assumptions could destroy the fragile balance of her life. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said. Ifeoma gave a faint, almost tired smile. "That's what people always say," she replied. Before anything else could be said, Mama Ngozi's medicine flashed in her mind. Time, responsibility, reality. "I need to go," she said, adjusting her tray. Obinna stepped slightly aside, not blocking her, not forcing her to stay, just watching. As she walked past him, back into the flow of the city, back into the life she understood. For a moment he remained where he was, still, thoughtful. Then Chinedu stepped closer. "That's her," he said quietly. Obinna nodded. "Yes, not a question, not a guess, a certainty." Chinedu glanced at Ifeoma's retreating figure. "What do we do now?" Obinna's eyes followed her, watching the way she blended into the crowd, invisible again. "We don't force her," he said finally. Chinedu looked surprised. "Sir, she didn't save me to be pulled into my world," Obinna continued. "If she walks away, there's a reason." A pause. "Then, but I'm not walking away," he added, because something about her, her strength, her refusal, her quiet dignity had already begun to change something inside him. And for the first time in a long time, he was willing to follow something that didn't come with control, even if it meant learning how to wait. The city did not notice when danger chose its next target. Lagos never did. It was too busy surviving its own noise, too full of stories overlapping, colliding, disappearing before anyone could follow them to the end. But Inside the polished walls of Easy Logistics Group something had already begun to shift, and this time it was no longer quiet. Ifeoma Nwoye stood by the large window in her office, her reflection staring back at her with unsettling calm. Below, traffic crawled in endless lines. People moved without pause. Life continued, but inside her mind, calculations were unfolding rapidly. Precise, controlled, and increasingly urgent. She met him, a voice said from behind. Ifeoma didn't turn immediately. She already knew who it was. Mr. Kalu stepped into the room, closing the door quietly behind him. His expression was no longer relaxed, no longer confident. There was tension now. Real tension, I heard Ifeoma replied, still facing the window. She didn't deny it. Well enough, Kalu continued. Chinedu noticed her yesterday, and now the boss has seen her himself. Ifeoma finally turned. Her face was composed, but her eyes had hardened slightly, and she asked. Kalu frowned. And this is a problem. Ifeoma walked slowly toward her desk. Only if we allow it to become one, she said calmly. Kalu let out a short breath. You don't understand. He's already changing. Since the accident, he's been different. Of course he has, Ifeoma replied. He almost died. That's exactly my point, Kalu said. People who survive something like that start asking questions. They stop trusting easily. Ifeoma paused for a moment, then nodded slightly. Yes, she said. They do. Silence settled between them, because both of them understood what that meant. Obinna was no longer the same man they had been able to predict, and unpredictability was dangerous. Do you think she knows anything? Kalu asked quietly. Ifeoma didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for a file on her desk, opened it. Pages filled with transaction records, hidden transfers, carefully layered deception. She was there, Ifeoma said finally. That alone makes her a risk. Kalu's jaw tightened. Then we remove the risk. Ifeoma looked up, her gaze sharp. No, she said firmly. Kalu frowned. No, we don't act without understanding the full picture, Ifeoma replied. If we move too quickly, we draw attention. Kalu stepped closer. And if we wait too long, we lose control. The word hung heavily in the air. Control. That was what this had always been about. Ifeoma closed the file slowly. We don't lose control, she said. We adjust. Across the city, Ifeoma had no idea her life had just been placed under a lens she could not see. She only knew that something felt different, not in a way she could explain, but in the way people had begun to look at her. Slightly longer, slightly more curious. Word had spread. Not clearly, not accurately, but enough. There's something about that girl, one vendor whispered to another. She spoke to a big man yesterday, someone else added. Ifeoma heard fragments, ignored them, because rumors had a way of growing into something bigger than truth, and she could not afford to be part of that. Still, a quiet unease settled in her chest, the kind that came without warning, the kind that told you something was shifting beneath your feet. That evening, Obinna sat alone in his office. He had returned to work earlier than anyone expected. Not because he was fully recovered, but because sitting still no longer felt possible. The company felt different now, not physically, but in the way silence moved through it, in the way conversations stopped when he entered a room, in the way eyes avoided his, just a little too quickly. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. Thinking, observing, waiting. A knock came at the door. Come in. Chinedu entered. I've compiled everything we have so far, he said, placing a file on the desk. Obinna didn't open it immediately. Tell me, he said instead. Chinedu nodded. We've confirmed her name. Ifeoma Okeke. Lives near Oshodi. Takes care of her grandmother. No criminal record. No known affiliations. No unusual activity. Obina listened carefully, and before the accident he asked. Nothing, Chinedu replied. She's exactly what she appears to be. Obina gave a faint nod. A street vendor, a caregiver, someone the world overlooked. And yet she had walked into fire. Anyone else looking into her? Obina asked. Chinedu hesitated. Not directly, he said. But there's been internal activity. Obina's eyes sharpened. Explain. Access logs, Chinedu said. Someone from inside the company pulled basic information on her this morning. It wasn't authorized. Silence. Cold. Immediate. Who? Obina asked. We're still tracing it, Chinedu replied. Obina leaned forward slowly, and for the first time since returning, the calm began to crack. Because this was not coincidence. Someone inside his company was watching the same girl who had been at the scene, the same girl who had pulled him out, the same girl who now refused to step into his world. Find out who accessed that data, Obina said quietly. Chinedu nodded. Already in progress. Obina stood, walking toward the window. The city stretched endlessly before him, alive, unaware, but his focus was no longer on the skyline. It was on something far smaller, far more fragile, and far more important. They're moving, he said under his breath. Chinedu stepped closer. Sir Obina turned slightly. They didn't act when I questioned the finances, he said. But now, they're watching her. Understanding dawned quickly in Chinedu's eyes. You think she's connected to whatever they're hiding, I think they think she is, Obina replied. And that was enough. Because perception, in a world built on secrets, was often more dangerous than truth. That night, Ifeoma walked home later than usual. The streetlights flickered unevenly. Shadows stretched long across the narrow paths. Her steps were slower. Not from exhaustion this time, from awareness. The feeling had grown stronger. That sense of being watched. She glanced behind her once, then again. Nothing. Just the usual movement, the usual noise. Still, something didn't feel right. She quickened her pace slightly. The small room she shared with Mama Ngozi came into view ahead. A sense of relief settled in her chest. Almost there, almost safe. But as she reached the door, she paused. Because something was different, subtle but unmistakable. The door was not fully closed. Her breath caught just for a second. Her hand tightened around the edge of her tray. Then slowly, carefully, she pushed the door open. The room was quiet. Too quiet. Mama Ngozi sat on the mat, her expression tense. Ifeoma, she said softly. Someone came here. The words hit harder than any noise. Ifeoma stepped inside quickly. Who, she asked. Mama Ngozi shook her head. I don't know. They didn't stay long. They were asking about you. Silence filled the small space. Heavy, unavoidable. For the first time since the fire, fear returned. Not the kind that makes you run. The kind that makes you think. The kind that tells you something has begun, and it is not over, not yet. Across the city, Obina stood by his window, looking out, but seeing something else entirely. The moment she pulled him from the fire, the moment everything changed, and now, the moment something darker was beginning to unfold. They're not just watching anymore, he said quietly. Chinedu looked at him. What do we do? Obina's expression hardened. This time, not with uncertainty, but with clarity. We protect her. Because the girl who had nothing had already risked everything, and now, the world that had ignored her was finally beginning to notice. The next morning, Lagos woke under a sky that felt heavier than usual. Nothing visible had changed. The roads were still crowded, vendors still called out. Life still moved with the same relentless rhythm. But beneath it, something was tightening. And for Ifeoma, Okeke, the feeling was no longer just a quiet unease. It had become real. She barely slept. Every small sound during the night had pulled her awake, the creak of wood, distant footsteps, even the wind brushing against the thin walls of their room. Her mind replayed Mama Ngozi's words over and over. Someone came here, asking about you. That was not normal, not for someone like her, not for a girl who had spent her entire life being overlooked. Now she was being seen, and that frightened her more than anything. Ifeoma, Mama Ngozi called softly. She turned immediately. "Yes, Mama. You didn't eat last night. I'm not hungry," Ifeoma replied. It wasn't entirely true, but fear had a way of pushing hunger aside. Mama Ngozi studied her carefully. "Is this about the man?" she asked gently. Ifeoma hesitated, then sat down beside her. "I don't know what it's about," she admitted quietly. "But something is wrong." Mama Ngozi reached out, placing a weak but steady hand over hers. "You did a good thing," she said. "Good things do not bring harm." Ifeoma wanted to believe that. She really did. But life had taught her something different. Sometimes doing the right thing simply made you visible. And being visible could be dangerous. "I'll be careful," she said softly. Mama Ngozi nodded, though concern still lingered in her eyes. By midday, Ifeoma was back at her usual spot. The tray balanced carefully, her posture steady, but her awareness sharper than ever. Every passing face felt like it might be watching. Every slowing car felt like it might stop. Every small shift in the crowd made her chest tighten slightly. She tried to focus on her work. Fresh corn, hot corn. Her voice carried, but it lacked its usual ease. Because today, she wasn't just selling. She was waiting for something she couldn't name. Not far away, a sleek black car sat quietly at the edge of the road. Engine off, windows slightly tinted. Inside, Chinedu watched, patient, observant. He had arrived early, before Ifeoma, before the crowd fully formed, and he had stayed, not to approach, not to interrupt, but to ensure one thing, that nothing happened to her. Beside him, a second car remained parked further down the road, unmarked, unnoticed. Obinna had made his instructions clear. No attention, no pressure, just protection. But even protection, when done quietly, carried its own tension, because it meant they were expecting something. Across the city, in a different part of Lagos, Ifeoma Nwoye stood in a dimly lit office that was not part of Eze Logistics. The building was older, less polished, but no less important. A man sat across from her, unknown to most, but very known to the kind of people who understood how power truly moved. "She's becoming a problem," the man said. Ifeoma didn't respond immediately. "She doesn't even know what she's involved in," she replied calmly. "That doesn't matter," he said. "She was there." Ifeoma's gaze remained steady. "And you think she saw something?" "I think she might have," the man said. "And right now the CEO is already interested in her. That makes her unpredictable." Ifeoma leaned back slightly, thinking, calculating. "We don't act directly," she said. The man frowned. "You're hesitating." "I'm being precise," Ifeoma corrected. "There's a difference." Silence. Then, "What's your plan?" Ifeoma's expression did not change. "We don't remove her," she said. "We discredit her." Back at the roadside, the sun had begun to lower slightly, though the heat still clung stubbornly to the air. Ifeoma shifted her weight, adjusting the tray slightly. Her eyes scanned the road. And then, a car slowed. Not unusual, but this one stopped. 3 men stepped out, not well-dressed like Obinna, not polished like Chinedu, but something about them was wrong. Ifeoma felt it immediately. The way they looked around, the way they moved, purposeful, direct. Her grip tightened slightly. They walked toward her. The crowd didn't react, because to everyone else it looked normal. But Ifeoma knew. This wasn't normal. "Now you be Ifeoma," one of them asked. Her heart skipped, but her face remained calm. "Yes," the man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We hear say you get big connection now," he said. "Big man come find you yesterday." Ifeoma didn't respond. The second man stepped closer. "People dey talk plenty," he continued. "Say you dey important now." The words sounded casual, but the meaning underneath was not. "I don't know what you're talking about," Ifeoma said quietly. The first man chuckled. "Ah, no worry," he said. "We just a check. The word settled heavily. Then his tone changed. Subtle, but sharp. "You go be careful, he added. "Sometimes. Attention no dey good for person. A warning, clear, unmistakable." Ifeoma held his gaze. She didn't step back, didn't lower her eyes. "Because fear, if shown, would only feed them. I understand," she said calmly. The men studied her for a moment longer. Then they stepped back, turned, and walked away. Just like that, as if nothing had happened, but everything had. Inside the car, Chinedu's hand tightened slightly. He had seen everything, every movement, every word. "Sir," he said into his phone quietly. "They've made contact. On the other end." Obina's voice came through. "Are you sure?" "Yes." A pause. "Then stay on," her Obina said. "No interference unless necessary." Chinedu nodded, though Obina couldn't see him. Understood. Back at the roadside, Ifeoma stood still for a moment. The tray suddenly felt heavier, the air tighter, the world louder. The warning echoed in her mind. Attention, no day good for person. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. But deep inside, she knew something had changed. This was no longer just about being seen. This was about being targeted. That evening, Obina stood alone in his office once again. The city lights flickered beyond the glass. Chinedu's report lay open on the desk, every detail clear, every movement accounted for. "They approached her," he said quietly. "Not a question, a statement." Chinedu nodded. "Yes." Silence stretched. Then Obina's expression hardened. Completely. No hesitation left. No uncertainty. "They've crossed the line," he said. Because this was no longer about suspicion, no longer about quiet observation. This was action, and action demanded response. Chinedu stepped closer. "What's the next move?" Obina didn't look away from the window, but his voice carried something different now, something stronger, colder, controlled. "We stop waiting." Because the girl who had once stood alone against fire was no longer alone. Not anymore. That night the city did not sleep. Lagos never truly did. But for Ifeoma Okeke, the darkness felt different, heavier, closer, as if something unseen had stepped into her world and refused to leave. She sat quietly on the floor beside Mama Ngozi, her back resting lightly against the wall, her hands folded in her lap. The tray of corn was gone, sold, forgotten, but her mind remained fixed on something else. The men, their voices, their warning, "You go be careful." The words echoed again. Not loud, not aggressive, but deliberate. That was what made it worse. They hadn't shouted, they hadn't threatened directly. They had simply made sure she understood. Mama Ngozi shifted slightly on the mat. "Ifeoma," she said softly. "You're not here." Ifeoma blinked, pulling herself back. "I'm here, Mama," but she wasn't, not fully. "Talk to me," Mama Ngozi said gently. Ifeoma hesitated. "Then finally some men came today," she admitted. Mama Ngozi's expression tightened immediately. "What kind of men I don't know," Ifeoma said. "But they knew my name. They knew about him." Silence filled the small room. Mama Ngozi's hand trembled slightly as she reached for Ifeoma's. "My child," she whispered. "This is not good." Ifeoma nodded. I know. The truth settled between them, heavy, unavoidable. For the first time since the fire, regret brushed against her thoughts. Not for saving him. Never that, but for what it had brought into her life. I didn't think. She began, then stopped. Because how could she have known? How could anyone? Mama Ngozi squeezed her hand, gently. You did what was right, she said. Do not regret that. I don't regret it, Ifeoma replied softly. And she meant it. But that didn't mean she wasn't afraid. I just don't understand why this is happening. Mama Ngozi looked at her with quiet sadness. Because the world is not always kind to those who do good, she said. The words were simple, but true. And Ifeoma felt them settle deep inside her chest. Across the city, Obinna Eze stood in a room filled with screens. Security footage, live feeds, reports, everything laid out with precision. Chinedu stood beside him, pointing to one of the monitors. That's them, he said. We've identified 2 of the men. They're connected to a private enforcement group used occasionally by corporate intermediaries. Obinna's eyes remained fixed on the screen. Cold, focused. Names, he said. Chinedu handed him a file. Obinna opened it, read, closed it again. They're not acting alone, he said quietly. No, Chinedu agreed. They wouldn't move without instruction. Silence. Then Kioma, Obinna said. Chinedu looked up. You think it's her? I don't think, Obinna replied. I'm starting to see. Because everything was aligning now. The financial discrepancies, the internal data access, the sudden interest in Ifeoma. This was not random. It was connected, and the connection led back to the same place. His own company, his own people. Do we confront her? Chinedu asked. Obinna shook his head slowly. Not yet, because confrontation without proof was weakness. And Obinna Eze had never built his empire on weakness. We watch, he said. Chinedu nodded, and Ifeoma Obinna's expression shifted slightly. Just for a moment, from steel to something more human. We move her, he said. Chinedu frowned slightly. Sir, she may not agree. I'm not asking her to agree, Obinna replied. Chinedu studied him carefully. Then you're going to force it. A pause. Then Obinna exhaled slowly. No, he said, because something about her, her strength, her refusal demanded respect. We convince her, he added, because this time he was not going to fail her. The next day, Ifeoma did not go to the roadside. For the first time in a long time, she stayed home, not out of weakness, out of caution. The room felt smaller than usual, the walls closer, the silence louder. Mama Ngozi watched her quietly. You're thinking too much, she said gently. Ifeoma gave a faint smile. I don't think enough, she replied. Mama Ngozi shook her head slightly. You think with your heart, she said. That is why you went into that fire. Ifeoma looked down. Would you have wanted me to walk away? Mama Ngozi didn't hesitate. No. The answer came instantly. Firm, certain. Then do not question who you are, Mama Ngozi added. Ifeoma nodded slowly, but the question wasn't about who she was. It was about what came next. A knock came at the door. Soft, controlled. Both of them froze. Ifeoma stood slowly. Every step toward the door felt heavier than the last. Her hand reached the handle. Paused. Then she opened it. Chinedu stood outside. Alone, calm, respectful. Good afternoon, he said. Ifeoma's expression didn't change. Good afternoon. I'm not here to cause trouble, Chinedu said immediately. I just want to talk. A pause. Then Ifeoma stepped slightly aside. Come in. The room was small, simple. Everything about it spoke of survival. Chinedu took it in quietly. Not with judgment, but with understanding. Thank you, he said. Mama Ngozi nodded at him from the mat. You're welcome. Chinedu turned back to Ifeoma. They came to see you yesterday, he said. Not a question, a statement. Ifeoma didn't deny it. Yes, they will come again, he continued. I know. Silence. Then you're not safe here, Chinedu said. The words landed heavily, but Ifeoma's expression remained steady. This is my home, she replied. Chinedu nodded. I understand, he said, but home should not feel like a place you have to watch the door. A pause. Then Mr. Obinna wants to help, he added. That changed the air. Slightly, but noticeably. I don't need help, Ifeoma said. Everyone needs help sometimes, Chinedu replied gently. Not like that, she said. Chinedu studied her, then nodded slowly. Not charity, he said. Protection. The word hung in the room. Different, stronger, more real. They're not just asking questions, he continued. They're testing how far they can go. Ifeoma's grip tightened slightly. She already knew that. You saved his life, Chinedu said. Now let him protect yours. Silence stretched. Mama Ngozi spoke softly. My child. Ifeoma closed her eyes briefly. Just for a second. Because this was the moment. The one where everything could change. Stay and face whatever was coming, or step into a world she didn't trust. A world that had already begun to reach into hers. She opened her eyes again, looked at Chinedu. What does he want from me? She asked quietly. Nothing, Chinedu replied, and for the first time. That answer was true, because this was no longer about debt, or gratitude, or obligation. It was about something else entirely. Something neither of them had expected. Something that had begun the moment fire met courage. He just doesn't want you to face this alone, Chinedu added. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Because the decision was no longer far away. It was here, now, and whatever she chose would change everything. For a long moment, Ifeoma said nothing. The room felt smaller than ever. Every breath heavier, every second stretching as if time itself was waiting for her answer. Outside, distant sounds of Lagos filtered in voices, engines, footsteps. But inside, everything was still. Protection, she repeated softly. The word lingered, not unfamiliar, but not something she had ever believed belonged to her. Chinedu didn't interrupt. He knew better. Some decisions could not be rushed. They had to unfold on their own. Ifeoma turned slightly, her eyes drifting toward Mama Ngozi. The old woman watched her quietly. Not with pressure, not with fear, but with understanding. My child, Mama Ngozi, said gently, sometimes accepting help is not weakness. Ifeoma swallowed. Her fingers tightened slightly at her sides. That kind of help always comes with something, she replied. Mama Ngozi shook her head slowly. Not always, but Ifeoma had lived long enough to know that not always did not mean never. She turned back to Chinedu. And if I say no, she asked. Chinedu held her gaze. Then we respect it, he said. A pause. But the danger doesn't go away. The truth of that settled quickly. Unavoidable. Ifeoma looked down for a moment, thinking, weighing, not just the risk to herself, but to Mama Ngozi. Because whatever was coming would not stop at her alone. That realization changed everything. She exhaled slowly, then looked up again. I won't leave my grandmother, she said. Chinedu nodded immediately. You won't have to. Another pause. Then I won't be treated like someone who owes anything, she added. You don't, Chinedu replied, and I won't stay where I'm not respected. Chinedu gave a faint, understanding smile. That won't happen. Silence again, but this time it felt like a decision was forming. Not out of fear, but out of responsibility. For her, Ifeoma said quietly, glancing at Mama Ngozi. Not for herself, never for herself. Chinedu nodded. I understand, because sometimes the strongest people only agreed to help when it wasn't about them. By evening, arrangements had already begun. Quiet, efficient, invisible to the outside world. A modest apartment in a safer part of the city. Not luxurious, not overwhelming, just enough, just right. When the car arrived, Ifeoma stood outside the small room she had called home for years. Her tray rested against the wall, her few belongings packed into a small bag. Everything she owned could be carried in her hands. She looked at the door, at the worn edges, at the familiar cracks in the wood. This place had held her through everything: hunger, struggle, loss, and small quiet moments of peace. Now she was leaving it, not by choice, but because something had forced her to. Mama Ngozi stepped beside her. "Home is not the walls," the old woman said softly. "It is the people inside them." Ifeoma nodded, but still letting go was not easy. She turned and walked toward the car. Across the city, Obina stood in his office, watching the skyline as evening settled in. The lights flickered on one by one, the city transforming into something softer. But inside him, nothing felt soft. "Have they moved?" he asked without turning. Chinedu's voice came through the phone. "Yes, they're on their way." Obina exhaled slowly. Good. At least now she wouldn't be alone. But even as that thought settled, another followed. Stronger, more unsettling. Why was this affecting him so much? He had helped people before, funded programs, donated, protected. But this felt different, because she had never asked, because she had walked away, because she had looked him in the eyes and chosen distance. That stayed with him, more than anything. When the car finally stopped, Ifeoma stepped out slowly. The building in front of her was simple, clean, quiet, very different from where she had come from. Too quiet. She glanced around, taking it in. "This is temporary," Chinedu said gently, "until things settle." Ifeoma nodded, but something inside her felt unsettled, not because the place was bad, but because it was unfamiliar. Inside the apartment was small but comfortable, a bed, a proper kitchen, a window that looked out over a calmer part of the city. Mama Ngozi was helped inside carefully. She looked around, her eyes soft. "This is good," she said. Ifeoma gave a small nod. "Yes." But her voice lacked certainty. Chinedu noticed. "It's not meant to change who you are," he said quietly. "It's meant to keep you safe." Ifeoma looked at him, then nodded again. "I understand." But safety felt different when it came from a world she didn't trust. That night, as the city settled into its restless sleep, Ifeoma stood by the window, looking out. The air felt different here, cleaner, quieter, but her thoughts were louder. Everything had changed so quickly, too quickly. One moment she was invisible. The next she was being watched, moved, protected, targeted. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to steady herself, trying to hold on to something familiar. But the truth was, there was no going back. Across the city, Obina sat alone in his office. The lights were off. Only the glow from the city outside illuminated the room. Chinedu's latest report lay on the desk. Movement confirmed, location secured. Ifeoma was safe, for now, but Obina knew. This was only the beginning, because people like Kalu, people like Kioma, did not stop easily. They adapted, they waited, they struck again. His hand tightened slightly. "Let them come," he said quietly. Not out of arrogance, but out of certainty. Because this time he was not reacting. He was ready. In another part of the city, Kioma stood in silence, staring at her phone. "They've moved her," the voice on the other end said. Kioma's expression didn't change. "Of course they did," she replied. A pause. "What now?" Kioma's eyes darkened slightly. For the first time, Something sharper surfaced beneath her calm. "We changed the approach," she said, "because this had never been about force. It had always been about control, and control did not require proximity, only precision." Back at the apartment, Ifeoma opened her eyes again. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass. Familiar, but not the same. Because something inside her had shifted. Not broken, not weakened, but awakened. She didn't fully understand it yet, but she felt it. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet realization began to form. That whatever had started on that road was far from over. And this time she would not just be the girl who saved someone. She would have to become something more. The city moved on. It always did. Accidents faded into memory. Headlines changed. Conversations shifted. But some moments, some decisions left ripples that refused to disappear. And what had happened on that road was one of those moments. 3 days after Ifeoma and Mama Ngozi were moved, the apartment had begun to feel less unfamiliar. Not comfortable, not yet, but no longer foreign. Ifeoma had adjusted quickly as she always did. She woke early, prepared food, checked on Mama Ngozi, moved through the space with quiet efficiency. But something was missing. The street, the noise, the rhythm of survival she had known her entire life. Here, everything was controlled, safe, and strangely still. She stood by the window again, looking down at the quiet street below. Cars passed, but not like before. No shouting vendors, no crowded movement, no chaos. For the first time in years, she had space to breathe. And yet she felt restless, because safety came with silence. And silence gave her too much time to think. Across the city, Obinna sat in the boardroom. The same room, the same long table, the same faces, but nothing about it felt the same anymore. Because this time he was not just observing, he was watching. Every movement, every reaction, every pause. "I've reviewed the internal audit again," he said calmly, his voice cutting through the room. No one interrupted. They had learned not to. "There are inconsistencies," he continued, "patterns that don't align with operational flow." He placed a file on the table, not sliding it, not presenting it, just placing it there. As if it didn't matter, but everyone knew it did. Ifeoma sat across from him, still composed, still calm, but her attention was sharper now, focused. "You've said that before," she replied evenly. "Do you have something new?" Obinna's gaze met hers. "Yes." The word landed quietly, but heavily. Because this time he did. Chinedu stepped forward, placing additional documents on the table. "These are access logs," he said, "from the company system." A pause. "Then they show unauthorized searches conducted 3 days ago." Silence. No one moved. No one spoke. Because now this was no longer theory. This was evidence. "Someone accessed information on a private citizen," Obinna said, "without authorization." Ifeoma didn't react, not outwardly. "Is that a crime?" she asked calmly. "It depends on the intent," Obinna replied. Their eyes locked, and for the first time, the tension between them became visible. Not hidden beneath professionalism, not softened by respect, but clear, direct. "And what do you believe the intent was?" Ifeoma asked. Obinna didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, looking at the rest of the room, then back at her. "I believe someone is trying to control a situation they don't fully understand," he said. The words were careful, measured, but unmistakable. Ifeoma's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. A shift, subtle but real. Mr. Kalu cleared his throat slightly. "Sir, if there are concerns about internal conduct, we can handle them discreetly," he said. "There's no need to escalate." "I'm not escalating," Obinna interrupted. His voice remained calm, but firmer now. "I'm clarifying." A pause. Then the accident was not random. The room froze, completely, because that That was new. "That's a serious claim," Ifeoma said slowly. "Yes," Obinna replied. "It is." Chinedu stepped forward again. "This vehicle," he said, placing an image on the screen, "was identified near the scene before the collision. It matches a known contractor used by external parties. No one needed clarification. Everyone understood. External parties was a polite way of saying something much more dangerous." Kalu shifted in his seat. "You're suggesting sabotage?" he asked. "I'm stating a possibility," Obinna replied. Then he leaned forward slightly. "And I'm stating that someone inside this company knew enough to act, or to hide it." Silence. Heavy, unavoidable. Ifeoma didn't look away. "Be careful, Obinna," she said quietly. It was the first time she had used his name like that. "Not sir, not formal, just direct. You're stepping into something without full proof." Obinna's expression remained unchanged. "No," he said. "I'm stepping into something with enough truth." Across the city, Ifeoma sat beside Mama Ngozi, helping her drink water slowly. The old woman's breathing had grown heavier over the past day. Not worse, but not better either. "We'll take you to the hospital tomorrow," Ifeoma said softly. Mama Ngozi shook her head slightly. "I'm fine." Ifeoma didn't argue, but her eyes said everything. "You're not." A knock came at the door. Soft, controlled. Ifeoma stood immediately, more alert now than ever. She moved to the door, carefully, opened it. Chinedu stood there, alone. "I'm sorry to come unannounced," he said, "but we need to talk." Ifeoma stepped aside. "Come in." Chinedu entered. His expression was different this time. More serious, more urgent. "What is it?" Ifeoma asked. Chinedu glanced briefly at Mama Ngozi, then back at her. "They know more than we thought," he said. Ifeoma's chest tightened slightly. "What do you mean they're not just asking about you?" he continued. "They're trying to connect you to the accident." Silence. "Then I don't know anything," Ifeoma said. "I know," Chinedu replied. "But they don't care about what you know," he added. "They care about what they think you might know." The words settled heavily. Because that was worse. Much worse. Back in the boardroom, the meeting had ended. But the tension remained. People left in silence, one by one, until only Ifeoma remained. She stood slowly, walking toward the window. Obinna didn't move, didn't speak. Then, "You've changed," Ifeoma said quietly. Obinna didn't respond. "You used to trust logic," she continued. "Now you're following instinct." Obinna finally looked at her. "Maybe I trusted the wrong things," he said. Ifeoma smiled faintly, not warm, not kind, just knowing. "Be careful," she said again. But this time it sounded less like advice, and more like a warning. That night, Ifeoma stood by the window once more. But this time she wasn't just thinking, she was understanding. Everything was connecting now. The men, the questions, the attention. This was bigger than her, bigger than the rescue. She had stepped into something she couldn't see. And now, it was closing in, behind her. Mama Ngozi's voice came softly. "My child." Ifeoma turned. "Yes, Mama." "You cannot run from this," the old woman said. Ifeoma nodded slowly. "I know. Because running would not change anything. It would only delay what was already coming." She looked back out at the city. Different now, no longer distant, no longer something she simply survived. Now it was something she had to face. And somewhere across that same city, a man who once needed saving was now preparing to stand beside her. Because the truth was no longer hidden, and the next step would change everything. The morning the truth surfaced, Lagos felt like it was holding its breath. Not because the city knew what was coming, but because something long buried had finally reached the point where it could no longer stay hidden. At Ezi Logistics headquarters, security had been tightened overnight. Not visibly, not in a way that would alarm the public. But inside access had changed. Movements were monitored. Doors that once opened freely now required confirmation. Because Obinna was no longer observing. He was acting. By 9 a.m. the boardroom was full. Every senior executive present. No absences, no excuses. Because the message had been clear, mandatory, urgent, final. Obinna stood at the head of the table. Not seated, not relaxed. Standing, commanding, but different. There was no anger in his face, no raised voice, just something colder, something certain. "We are not here for discussion today," he said. The room fell silent immediately. "We are here for truth." Chinedu stepped forward, placing a series of documents and digital displays across the table. Transaction records, vehicle logs, communication traces, everything aligned, everything connected. This, Obinna continued, is the full reconstruction of the events leading up to my accident. The word, accident, lingered. Then he corrected it. My attempted removal. No one spoke, because now there was no room for doubt. A screen lit up behind him. Footage appeared. Grainy, distant, but clear enough. A vehicle following his SUV, maintaining distance, matching speed. Another angle. The moment before impact. The deliberate shift. The calculated move. Not random, not accidental, planned. A ripple of tension spread across the room. But no one interrupted. No one dared. Financial records show internal approvals tied to external contractors, Obinna continued. Contracts authorized under false pretenses. He turned slightly, his gaze landing directly on Mr. Kalu. Kalu's face had lost its composure, only slightly, but enough. "This authorization passed through your office," Obinna said. Kalu swallowed. "Sir, you signed it," Obinna cut in. Calm, precise, irrefutable. Silence. Then Obinna's gaze shifted again. To Ifeoma. She hadn't moved, hadn't reacted. Still composed, still watching. "Access logs show unauthorized tracking of a civilian," he said. Ifeoma, though he didn't say her name. He didn't need to. "You knew who she was," he continued. Ifeoma tilted her head slightly. "Of course I did," she said. "You made her important." The room stiffened. "Because that was not denial. That doesn't explain why you accessed her information," Obinna replied. Ifeoma smiled faintly. "Because I needed to understand the risk," she said. "And what risk was that?" Obinna asked. Her eyes met his, unflinching. "That she might connect you to what happened," she said. The words landed sharply. But something about them was wrong. Not entirely false, but not entirely true either. Obinna stepped forward. "Say it clearly," he said. Ifeoma's expression hardened slightly. "You want clarity?" she asked. Then she stood, slowly, deliberately. "Yes," she said. "The accident was not random." The room froze. Again, but this time there was no shock, only confirmation. "We needed leverage," Ifeoma continued. "You were becoming difficult to control." Kalu closed his eyes briefly. Because now there was no turning back. Ifeoma didn't stop. "The financial structure was already in place," she said. "We built it carefully, quietly. But you started asking questions." She took a step forward. "So we created pressure." Her voice remained calm, as if she were explaining something simple, something logical. "The accident was meant to scare you," she added, "not kill you." Obinna's jaw tightened slightly. "But you survived," she said. And then she appeared. Ifeoma, unspoken, but present in every word. That complicated things, Ifeoma continued, because now there was a witness. Across the city, Ifeoma stood in a small room inside a private facility. Not a police station, not a hospital. Somewhere in between. Safe, but unfamiliar. Chinedu stood beside her. They're about to expose everything he said. Ifeoma nodded slowly. Her hands were steady, but her heart was not. "Do I have to speak?" she asked quietly. Chinedu looked at her. "Only if you want to," he said. A pause. "But your presence matters." Ifeoma exhaled slowly, because she understood now. This was not just about her, not just about what she saw. It was about truth, and whether she would stand in it. Back in the boardroom, Obina's voice cut through the tension again. "You used my company," he said. "My trust, my people." Kioma didn't deny it. "Because you allowed it," she replied. The words were sharp, but not entirely wrong, and that made them dangerous. Obina took another step forward, and now he asked. Kioma smiled faintly. "This is where you think you win," she said. A pause. Then, "But power doesn't collapse that easily." The doors opened. Suddenly, security entered. Not aggressively, but decisively. Kalu stood immediately, his composure gone. "This is not necessary," he said quickly. "We can resolve this," No, Obina said. And this time there was no calm, only finality. "This is where it ends." Kioma didn't resist, didn't step back, didn't look afraid. She simply watched, as everything she had built began to fall. At that same moment, Ifeoma stepped into the building, escorted, quietly, unnoticed by most, but not by Obina. Their eyes met across the room. For a brief second, everything else disappeared. The tension, the power, the noise. It was just them. The man who had almost died, and the girl who had refused to let him. Obina nodded once. Not as a command, not as authority, but as acknowledgement. "You stood when it mattered. Now so will I." Ifeoma didn't move forward, didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough, because the truth no longer needed to be hidden. It was here, visible, unavoidable. And for the first time, the people who had controlled everything had lost control. As security led Kalu away, he glanced back once. Fear. Real fear. The kind that came too late. Kioma followed, still calm, still composed, but something in her eyes had changed. Not defeat, not regret, just recognition that this was the end of her control. The room slowly emptied. Executives left in silence. No one spoke, no one questioned, because they had seen enough, heard enough, understood enough, and in the center of it all, Obina stood, looking at Ifeoma, not as a CEO, not as a man of power, but as someone who knew exactly what had almost been lost. "You shouldn't have had to be part of this," he said quietly. Ifeoma shook her head. "Neither should you." A pause. "Then is it over?" she asked. Obina looked around, at the empty room, at the space where truth had finally surfaced, then back at her. "Yes," he said. And this time it was not uncertainty. It was certainty. Because the fire that had almost taken everything had also revealed everything, and now there was nothing left to hide. The city did not stop. It never did. Even after truth had been exposed, after power had shifted, after lives had been pushed to the edge and pulled back again. Lagos continued. Cars still filled the roads. Vendors still called out. People still hurried past one another, carrying their own struggles, their own stories. But for those who had stood inside that boardroom, nothing was the same. The news spread quickly, not in whispers, not in fragments, but clearly, directly. Top executives arrested in corporate sabotage case. CEO survives planned attack, internal conspiracy exposed. Unknown. Heroine behind rescue, finally identified. For the first time, Ifeoma Okeki's name entered the world. Not as a rumor, not as a passing mention, but as a truth that could no longer be hidden. In the days that followed, Ezi logistics transformed. Not overnight, not perfectly, but deliberately. Obina did not rush to replace those who had fallen. He did not fill the silence with noise. Instead, he rebuilt. carefully, system by system, trust by trust, because he understood that power without integrity was nothing more than a structure waiting to collapse. Chinedu remained by his side, steady, loyal, but even he noticed the change. Obinna listened more, spoke less, observed differently. Not from suspicion alone, but from understanding. Because the man who had once believed control was enough, now knew that survival sometimes depended on something much simpler. People, the right people. Across the city, Ifeoma stood once again by a roadside. Not the same one, not the same conditions, but still, standing, selling, living. She had been offered more. A job, a place inside the company, a different life. But she had declined. Not out of pride, not out of fear, but because she wanted to choose her path, not be carried into it. Still, things had changed. People looked at her differently now. Some with admiration, some with curiosity, some with disbelief. "You're the girl from the news," a woman said one afternoon. Ifeoma smiled faintly. "Yes." "Why are you still here?" the woman asked. Ifeoma adjusted her tray slightly. "Because this is where I am," she replied. The answer was simple, but it carried something deeper. She had not saved a man to become someone else. She had done it because it was right, and that did not need to change. Mama Ngozi's health improved gradually. Not dramatically, but enough. Enough for her to sit outside some evenings. Enough for her to smile more often. Enough for hope to feel real again. One evening as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in warm gold, Ifeoma sat beside her. "You've grown," Mama Ngozi said softly. Ifeoma laughed gently. "I've always been like this." Mama Ngozi shook her head. "No," she said. "Now you know it." Ifeoma fell quiet. Because that was true. Something inside her had shifted. Not because of attention, not because of recognition, but because she had seen what she was capable of. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. Across the city, Obinna stood in a different place. Not his office, not a boardroom, but a small community center, on the edge of a neighborhood that looked very familiar. Too familiar, because it reminded him of something he had not seen in years. Reality. He stood quietly as workers moved around setting up equipment, arranging supplies. A new initiative, not for publicity, not for image, but for impact. Healthcare access, small business support, education programs, not charity, opportunity. Chinedu stepped beside him. "This will help a lot of people," he said. Obinna nodded. "It should have started a long time ago." A pause. "Then she's here," Chinedu added. Obinna turned and saw her, Ifeoma, standing at the entrance, not hesitant, not unsure, just present. He walked toward her. This time, not as a man searching, but as a man who had found. "You came," he said. "I said I would," she replied. A faint smile touched his lips. "Yes, you did." They stood in silence for a moment. Not uncomfortable, not forced, just real. "I don't belong in your world," Ifeoma said quietly. Obinna shook his head. "That's not true." She looked at him, questioning. "You changed it," he added. The words settled between them. Not as praise, but as acknowledgement. Because without her, none of this would have happened. Not the truth, not the exposure, not the transformation. "I didn't do it for that," she said. "I know," he replied. "That's why it matters." A pause. Then, "What happens now?" she asked. Obinna looked around, at the people, at the work, at the future unfolding quietly. "We move forward," he said. Not grand, not dramatic, just honest. And for the first time, that felt enough. As the sun set over Lagos, the city glowed with its usual restless beauty. Nothing had stopped, nothing had slowed. But somewhere within it, something had changed. A man who had once been surrounded by power but alone, now understood the value of truth. A girl who had once been invisible, now understood the strength within herself, and between them there was no debt, no obligation, no imbalance, only a shared moment that had rewritten both their lives. Somewhere people would forget. They always did. The news would fade, the story would be replaced, but the impact, the quiet, lasting impact would remain. Because sometimes it only takes one moment, one decision, one act of courage to change everything. Sometimes the world teaches us that power belongs to those who have money, influence, or control. But stories like this remind us of something deeper. Real power is found in choice. The choice to act when others stand still. The choice to care when others look away. The choice to remain human in a world that often forgets what that means. Ifeoma did not have wealth. She did not have status. She did not have protection. But in the moment that mattered most, she had courage. And that courage did something extraordinary. It saved a life, and in doing so, it revealed the truth. Hidden behind power exposed injustice and reminded a man who had everything what truly mattered. But the lesson doesn't stop there. Because Obinna also made a choice. He chose to listen, to change, to use his power not to control, but to protect and rebuild. And that is where real transformation begins. Not in grand gestures, but in honest decisions.
So today, ask yourself, if you were standing there, would you step forward or would you look away? If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your country. We'd love to connect with you. And if you believe in stories that remind us of humanity, courage, and justice, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the world needs more stories like this.